Windows versus Bazzite, the SteamOS alternative that everyone is using as of late. Which do you think is going to run better on AMD's latest mobile platform, their Strix Point platform, specifically the HX370 that we see running in the brand new 2025 edition of the GPD Win Mini? This is a fantastic handheld, and I would argue that Bazzite is a preferred OS to run on this. This might make more sense as we take a look at benchmarks later on in this video. There are also a few peculiarities with how Bazzite runs, and we're going to show you off some of the things that Bazzite does, which kind of cheats a little bit. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and why I had to kind of finesse some of the benchmarks in a different way to show off something that is a little bit more accurate and apples to apples. We'll get into that in just a moment, but one of the big things that has changed with AMD Strix Point, the HX370 model that we have here, this is the first mobile APU from AMD that has heterogeneous cores. So we have performance cores as well as efficiency cores. Now, Windows 24H2, Windows 11 24H2, the latest version of Windows 11, is technically the current best operating system to run on Windows for Strix Point because the scheduler does a lot better on 24H2 than it does in previous versions of Windows 11. Unfortunately for Windows, Linux has had just a tremendous amount of work on CPU schedulers. There are also other CPU schedulers that you can use, but the default one that Bazzite uses is exceedingly good for the heterogeneous CPU cores that we find on the HX370. Not only that, specifically when we take a look at Cyberpunk, there are also enhancements on Proton's side for AMD CPU and GPU stuff where it becomes a 1-2 punch where Bazzite just destroys Windows and benchmarks. Now, we're going to get further in on benchmarks. You're not going to see as drastic of results as Cyberpunk 2077, but there are still clear wins, even at lower power for the HX3070, something that I was more expecting to find on the Windows side. But we are seeing them on the Bazzite side. So that is really nice to see. The one thing that I do want to talk about real quick is, well, with standby time, now we are using modern standby on this. Typically, I would prefer using Hibernate as I would on Windows. On Bazzite, we would be using modern standby. In around 4 hours, I use 2% of my battery, almost 3%. So not the best at all, not good, not great. So just keep that in mind that in a 24-hour period, you might lose around 10% of your battery. With Bazzite on here without being able to hibernate. Hibernate, you wouldn't use any battery, obviously, because it would be off, and you would then be loading off of the disk back into RAM. So we don't really have that option on Bazzite, so just keep that in mind, even though I really do recommend Bazzite altogether. We will be talking a lot about power, but very quickly I wanted to show off some gameplay segments, specifically with games like Space Marines 2. With the latest update for Space Marines 2, we do have FSR3 FrameGen, which is active here, and I am using low settings, 720p resolution. Altogether, what you're taking a look at here is very good frame rate. Like even when we have explosions on the screen, we're only dipping down to about 70 FPS, so that would be about 35 FPS, the actual render FPS. This is actually running at 15 watt on Bazzite. What that basically means is that you're going to get around 90 minutes of battery life on the GPD Win Mini in this particular instance. Now, the GPU Win Mini, this only has a 45 watt-hour battery, so don't go expecting miracles out of this battery. But at 15 watt, expect around 90 minutes when juicing it a lot. Now, the peculiar thing that happens, we should take a quick segue away from this, is that one at 15 watt, what ends up happening is we see that in very specific GPU instances, when we have a means of being able to get work done on the CPU, but also being able to flex on the GPU more, what ends up happening is even though 100% the TDP is set to 15 watt, the overall effect is that the system is closer to using 17 watt. And when we compare 17 watt on Windows compared to 15 watt on Bazzite, we see that they're effectively using the same amount of total system power, which is an odd thing to see. And what winds up happening is that 15 watt on Bazzite cannot be directly compared to 15 watt on Windows 1-to-1. So in some instances, you will see that as the benchmarks later on, I will not show 15 watt versus 15 watt. And instead, I'll only be doing 10 watt and 20 watt together. Just give a bit more of a clear indication of what's going on. Having said that, that is just a peculiarity that happens. Ultimately, the thing that I would recommend here is that if you are going to run Bazzite on the GPU and Mini, just run at 15 watt. 15 watt is often a fantastic TDP to run at. It's also going to make sure that you have very good battery life. The other bit of good news is that Bazzite does support pretty much everything that the GPU Win can offer. So it does have VRR support, which you can see in the quick access menu, which you can just quickly bring up by pressing the menu and the A button at the same time. And that will bring up the quick access menu where you have all of the same similar type of quick access menu utilities that you would on a Steam Deck itself. So all of that is present. Even selecting TDP directly works in this without having to do any particular work whatsoever. In the background, that uses Ryzen Adjust, so that works as you would expect it to work, and there is no particular issues whatsoever. So that's really cool that all of that just works and you can quickly and easily just set TDP and not really have to worry about it so much. Very cool to see. But also, even in this particular instance, again, I'm running 15-watt Ratchet and Clank is getting around 80 FPS here. Super smooth. Again, FSR3 frame gen is on. So what you're taking a look at is just something that looks very good. We're using XeSS for upscaler and FSR 3.1 frame gen running. And between both of those, we have a very good upscaler from XeSS and frame gen running. Ultimately, what winds up happening is we have very good image quality and what looks and feels like very smooth gameplay. It becomes something that I wouldn't have really imagined in my wildest dreams, running 15-watt on a device. Yes, we are not really running native render or that type of stuff, but ultimately how it looks and feels is really good. So very impressive to see. One other thing that we need to talk about is all the other hotkeys and functions on the GPU Win Mini function just fine on Bazzite as well. So if you were to use any of the hotkeys to increase brightness or the sound, all of that works just fine. Sound works without a problem. Wi-Fi worked without a problem. Ultimately, as far as I can tell, everything works without a hitch. The only bit that doesn't work is using the touchpad. While the touchpad can work for the mouse, because there is no actual click, it's supposed to be a tap. When you tap, there is no mouse input. Even double tap doesn't show up as right click. So unfortunately, that does not work on Bazzite at the current moment. But you could always just use the touchscreen because that does work. If we were to use the keyboard as well, so instead of using the touchscreen for typing, you can use the full thumb typeable keyboard that is on the GPU Mini as well. And that is great, right? Like you can just type whatever you want, put in whatever game you want. And in my particular instance, I love typing adventure games, and there is newer typing adventure games that have come out. So I want to quickly just show, like I'm showing off this Crimson Rose game, but also older Space Quest games, right? Older text adventure games. If we take a look at Space Quest 2 here, keyboard obviously works. Everything is fine. The only thing that should stand out to you is that we are using an outrageous amount of power for running Space Quest 2. So even though I still have the TDP set to 15 or 17 watt or whatever, we're using 11 watts total on system power, and that's really high. The good news is that because we can just jump into quick access menu and then lower the TDP ourselves down to about 4 watt, we can see that that will automatically change the amount of total system power that's being used without any particular difference in performance. Obviously, it's a very old game. And what you're seeing here, when that see the 10 FPS, you can kind of disregard that because that is also in line with the slow setting of the game that it's running at. So disregard the FPS that you're seeing there. Ultimately, the game runs fine and can run with less power. That doesn't mean that every game actually needs this type of course correction. You don't need to be super mindful of it all the time. So a game that I always love showing off is Celeste. Now, Celeste on Windows is a game that we definitely manually need to step in on TDP to finesse getting better power. Otherwise, on Windows, it will spin its wheels and waste power. On Bazzite, it does it automatically. So even though I have power at 15 watt, you can see that it's only using around 6 watt and total system power. So effectively, it's going down to 3 watt. One thing that I would ask the Bazzite developers is to have an override where we can set the TDP slider even lower, because as I'm able to show here, when I force the device at 1 watt, we can actually get slightly better power, and it's about 10% better. We can go down to about 5.5 watt instead of using 6 watt. Now, that may not seem like a lot, but especially at the lower end, that really is going to drastically affect how much total battery life that we have. So that's one thing that I would like to see. And also, like when you see I put it at 1 watt, all of the CPU cores pretty much get locked at 600 megahertz. Now, just because I put it at 1 watt does not mean that the system uses 1 watt. I'm just basically saying, hey, system, use 1 watt, and that just tells the system to use as little power as possible, which is not able to do. It's actually going to use around 3 to 4 watts regardless. So it is not able to actually adhere to the demands I put on it. It will basically just force itself into its absolute lowest power state. And that's what I would really like to ask from the Bazzite devs themselves, is to have just an override somewhere in that quick access menu, or just allow it just to go down to 1 watt. Because even when you put 1 watt, it doesn't necessarily mean the system is going to use 1 watt and become unusable. It'll just use as little power as possible. And that's just for really trying to go for the maximum amount of battery life that we can possibly go to. So even on the HX370, we can go to very low power, and that's something that I think is worth showing off. So with showing off gameplay demos and talking about some of the features that just work on Bazzite and some of the features that I would like to see on Bazzite, specifically for a TV going down to 1 watt, let's take a look at benchmarks to see how much better Bazzite is over Windows. So the first game that we'll be taking a look to compare Windows 24 H2 to Bazzite, which is a SteamOS alternative, is Batman Arkham Knight. I'm running at 720p max settings, which you can see at the top of this right here. Right here in this section right here, right behind me, this highlighted section, all the highlighted fields, those will be Bazzite, and everything that's not highlighted, like what you can see right here, that's going to be Windows 24 H2. Now, one thing that we do see is that Bazzite does a really good job being as efficient as possible. So at 10 watt, we do have a modest gains, right? So we have 5% better on averages at 10 watt. We have 9% better on 1 percentile and about 14% better on 0.2 percentile. That's fairly decent considering both are using very little power. At 15 watt, things kind of change a bit. On averages, we have 6% better on Bazzite. However, our 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile take a little bit of a nosedive, and we take like a 10% hit on 1 percentile and a 13% hit. So pretty much inverted when we go up to 15 watt. Now, what's interesting here, especially what I've already told you before, is that there are times when the GPU is getting engaged at 15 watt, it'll actually start extracting a bit more power, and the result will be that total system power will also bump up a bit. So 15 watt is kind of hard to show off every now and again. Any game that is going to be very demanding on GPU, you're going to see Bazzite kind of extract a bit more power. And the difference between 15 watt and 17 watt is actually around 15%. So you're going to see like really big differences going 15 watt to 15 watt. So there's going to be some games that I'm showing you where it's only 10 watt versus 20 watt. And the reason for that is because it gets really wishy-washy. So ultimately, I have to just finish my work on benchmarking games against total system power, but I'm trying to just give a better apples-to-apples comparison right here. At 20 watt, there really isn't going to be much of a difference, even if we do start bumping up power in Bazzite. In this particular case, it really doesn't. So you can see averages are about 1% better, and 1 percentile is about 4% better on Windows, and about 5% better on Windows as well. So ultimately, the difference between Bazzite and Windows here is that on the low end, Bazzite does very well. You know, not crazy good, but still decent enough gains for going to low power, something that is worthwhile. So Bazzite's really good on low power, but as we start going to 15 and 20 watt, there really isn't that much of a difference. Windows, I would say, is actually in a better spot just because it's 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile is in a much better position. So this is something that you should kind of almost anticipate, right? Because we have that overhead that we should be using with Proton. So this is still good results, and it's not anything that you would say is bad or good. Both of these are kind of just fine. Things take a drastic turn when we take a look at the difference between Cyberpunk, though, so let's take a look at that. And the next game we'll be taking a look at is Cyberpunk 2077. This is 720p with the Steam Deck preset and no upscaling, so this is rendering at 720p native. And I have removed the 15 watt results here, and the reason I removed those is, like I showed you earlier on in this video, sometimes when you put the device at 15 watt, especially in certain instances, we can find that the device is actually pulling a bit more power up to about 17 watt. If we take a look at total system power, this becomes very self-evident. So I wanted to remove this part out of there because the differences between 15 watt and 17 watt will be vast. And on top of Bazzite just doing so much better, it just looks like a clear blowout. So I have just kind of minimized this to 10 watt and 20 watt, but we still see a gigantic difference between both of these. At 10 watt, we can see that our averages are around 28% better on Bazzite, and our 1 percentile is 49% better on 1 percentile, and our 0.2 percentile is 53% better. That is a drastic difference between 10 watt on both of these systems, and the difference in power that might be happening there is not going to be so self-evident that we're going to see these gigantic increases. And especially at 20 watt, right? Because at 17 to 20 watt, the power increase is not going to be a big enough jump. There's going to be, that's where diminishing returns really starts to highlight itself. Where going from 17 watt to 28 watt is really where we start to see another 10% or 15% more performance. But the difference between 17 watt and 20 watt really isn't a bunch, or even 20 to 22 watt isn't really going to move the needle all that much. But what we're seeing here is on averages on 20 watt to 20 watt, we're looking at averages being 35% better on Bazzite. If we look at 1 percentile, it's 43% better. And if we look at 0.2 percentile, it's 53% better. So this is like just a gigantic difference where 10 watt and 20 watt kind of show a clear difference between both of these. And this is what I think a lot of people were expecting to see from HX370, because when I showed AMD's 8840U in my previous video, but just on Windows to Windows, it didn't look all that impressive. And truthfully, the heterogeneous cores that we find on the HX370 are a bit of a detriment on Windows. And on Bazzite, we can see that we are able to more easily extract that performance. And Cyberpunk 2077 is a game that has been shown a lot of love on Proton, so that is really like highlighting how much of a benefit it is to run on Bazzite. So far we have Batman, where it's kind of better on Windows, but only slightly better on Windows. And then we take a look at Cyberpunk, and Bazzite is just drastically better on Bazzite versus Windows. So if you had a choice, so far the choice should be you should only use Bazzite. But let's go ahead and take a look at our next game. The next game that we'll be taking a look at is Deus Ex: Mankind Divided. This is running the DirectX 11 backend and Ultra settings in the graphic settings. This is a very, very demanding DirectX 11 game. It has its own engine. It's a game that I love showing. So we're going to take a look at the difference again between 10 watt and 20 watt. So at 10 watt, our averages are around 15% better on Bazzite and 29% better on 1 percentile and 16% better on our 0.2 percentile. So that is drastically better. 10 watt in these particular settings, these are very GPU focused types of settings, we would not technically recommend it. You would have to bump it up. 15 watt would be a better wattage to run this at for this particular game and particular settings. Obviously you can run less settings and go down to 10 watt. But if we were to take a look at 20 watt, again, our averages are around 12% better on averages, 20% better on 1 percentile, and 26% better on 0.2 percentile. So again, Bazzite clearly wins. There is not even just like a little bit of a difference where it's like, oh, okay, 5% difference on 1 percentile and 8% difference on 0.2 percentile. We have massive differences in both, where Bazzite is just a clear winner regardless of whatever we're looking at. So again, Bazzite wins here, and it's really just being a thing where if you have HX370 and it's on a handheld, I would, at this current moment, until Windows gets its stuff sorted together, go to Bazzite or SteamOS when that becomes available. The next game we'll be taking a look at is Horizon Zero Dawn. This is running at 720p native with the favorite performance preset. This is again an instance where I am removing 15 watt out of there just because I feel like it's encroaching on that 17 watt area. So we're going to get a better idea of how these actually compare. 10 watt to 10 watt on our averages, we're looking like 9% better on Bazzite, 20% better on our 0.1% on our 1 percentile, and our 0.2 percentile is about 25% better. That is alarmingly good. Basically what that means is that at 10 watt, you really wouldn't want to run Horizon Zero Dawn on Windows, but on Bazzite, you would want to run at 10 watt. That's a very comfortable frame rate that you're going to run there. We're able to hit 30 FPS consistently across the board, so that's always going to have a nice consistent frame rate for you. Going up to 20 watt, we can see that our averages are around 8% better on Bazzite. Our 1 percentile is about 11% better, and our 0.2 percentile is also 11% better. So again, we're in a situation where I would say on the lower end that Bazzite shows off much, much better. Like at 10 watt, we're seeing that we're able to extract more from the system with less power. But at 20 watt, the extras that we're getting there, while better, is not something that we should really be like celebrating all that much. It's not like through the rooftops. It's clearly better, but not anything that it would be jaw-dropping. Still, I would say that Bazzite clearly is winning, and out of all of them, only Batman Arkham Knight has Windows actually won on, like in terms of comparison. And in this instance, I would once again choose Bazzite. So Overall, Bazzite is still a clear recommendation. We're going to go to the last game that we're going to be taking a look at. And the last game that we're going to be taking a look at, one that I often end on, is Returnal. This is running 720p. However, it is using FSR2 balanced, so it is running at a sub-resolution of 720p and upscaling to that, and it has low settings. All of these are relaxed settings on the GPU side just because it is a very GPU demanding game and kind of stresses these iGPUs on handhelds that we have. And it's going to be a kind of a game that is going to highlight a lot of the differences for these as better GPUs come around. So this is a great game that I love showing off. What's interesting is that Windows actually does a good job holding its own here. So on 10 watt, we can see that our averages are about 12% better on averages versus Bazzite, and our 1 percentile is 2% better, but our 0.2 percentile is actually better on Bazzite by 11%. So ultimately, at 10 watt even, Windows is doing a fantastic job. So drivers wise, everything else, just going for GPU only, not having to care so much about the CPU side of things. Clearly, Windows is winning. Everything goes to muck when the CPU has to start doing stuff, which Bazzite clearly wins in hands down, and we've done a bunch there. So that's really the secret sauce for Bazzite, is just on the CPU scheduler side, which Microsoft could fix this, right? They really have to get the ball on the roll here because it's kind of embarrassing. And then when we go up to 20 watt, Windows still wins as well. If we look at our averages, we're about 12% better on averages. For 1 percentile, Bazzite's about 8% better, and our 0.2 percentile, Bazzite's about 26% better. So far more consistent Bazzite is far more consistent in terms of frame time and everything else, but we are still showing really good GPU strides on Returnal for Windows. So ultimately, I still think that Windows is a winner here just because we have a good chunk of a lead on averages, and our 1 percentile, which is kind of where I feel this whole thing lands on, is still very solid. It's only in the 0.2 percentile that Bazzite keeps that consistency going. Ultimately, Bazzite is still a clear good choice here, regardless of anything, right? Windows, in this one case, because it's such a GPU-driven game and CPU doesn't matter as much, we can see that Windows actually comes to the table with something. So ultimately, what this comes down to is that Bazzite is doing a far better job of managing the entire system across all these benchmarks. And when we take a look at Batman Arkham Knight, that is one area where Windows has some semblance of actually doing the correct thing, even on CPU and GPU, right? So Batman Arkham Knight is a great indicator of seeing the difference between the two, where it almost seems like Windows has its stuff together. Because when we take a look at them, Windows has a clear lead across everything, right? So, but not huge, but marginally better. And then everything just kind of goes to crap real fast for every other game that we look at. So ultimately, I think Bazzite is a clear winner for HX370 model handhelds right now. I would opt to go there as a general guideline because of that, but I have a little bit more to say right now. So is that what you were expecting out of Bazzite? I feel like some of you were anticipating that Bazzite would show up on the HX370, but specifically especially compared to my previous review when I looked at the 8840U versus the HX370 on Windows, I feel like a few of you were a little bit surprised to see it. And ultimately what it comes down to is when we run Bazzite, you can see how much better HX370 can go. Like, it is able to do better, but Windows really just lets us down. Ultimately, what that comes down to is that if you wanted to run Windows exclusively on the GPD-Win Mini or handheld and specifically, the 8840U is still a fantastic choice, and Windows doesn't have any particular problem running on that because there is no heterogeneous cores on the 8840U. So you get all that consistency, and it's easier to run. If you're going to go to the HX370, there are instances where it's better, especially when you start pushing more power. But if you care about battery life, that's where Windows doesn't really make much sense for the HX370, especially compared to the 8840U. The HX370 does make a lot of sense in Bazzite, and we can see all those gains that are coming in. So if you were planning on not using Game Pass and you were fine with what basically SteamOS allows, right? You can do all PC games outside of Game Pass. If that's all you care about, then the HX370 starts making a lot of sense when installing something like Bazzite, or even when SteamOS beta comes out later in a few months. So that is something to keep in mind between the two. I think ultimately the 8840U is still a fantastic device for this particular model. especially because it's going to be able to go to both of those and have good results for either one. It's really just on Bazzite where the HX370 is really going to start showing things that shine on that particular unit. So that's ultimately what it comes down to between Bazzite and Windows. And I think especially for AMD's heterogeneous cores where we're seeing this large difference between the two. Anyway, thank you very much to my YouTube channel members as well as my Patreon members. Your support really means the world to me, guys. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time and thanks for watching.